Today we're going to be learning Megillah Daf Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Katriella Friedman in loving memory of her mother on a 5th year at site, Gerda Stein, Frida Bat Fruma. She died in Eretz Yisrael, the place she firmly believed was her spiritual home. I think of you every day and always hear your encouragement to pursue the intellectual and thoughtful life. And today's daf is sponsored by Julie Mendelson in honor of her son, who was sworn in an Israeli Air Force officer yesterday. As usual, the daf speaks to life. Not only are you now a captain of the army of God, but throughout your course, you never gave up on your learning, your tefillah, and your Torah lifestyle. During all of your hard training, you got up even earlier to pray, spent your free time on Shabbat learning, and were a great example for all the soldiers in your unit. I am so proud of you and wish you a safe and meaningful service. Mazal tov, very beautiful. Okay, we're going to get started. We have very interesting daf. We're going to start with the sheet will help you kind of keep organized where we're going in the daf and what's happening. So, number one, we're going to start with the 4 additional laws that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said. Yesterday, we saw 4 of them that mainly had to do with this issue of a krach, what is defined as a walled city, depending, right? Some of them related to Purim and some of them related to the Batei Choma when it comes to laws of redeeming property. Now we're going to talk about another relating to a krach, and then we're going to go off on other things relating to Purim. So starting with the last 2 words of Daf Gimel Amud Bet. V'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Lod v'Ono v'Gei Harashim u'Kafot Choma miyemot Yehoshua ben Nun havu. He's listing 3 cities that he claims were walled cities from the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, question. V'hane Yehoshua banani? You think Yehoshua built those cities? No, those cities weren't around in the time of Yehoshua. El Pa'al banani. Okay, El Pa'al did it. Now you might say, who on earth is El Pa'al? Well, he comes up in the book of Chronicles. And it says there, Dichtiv, and how do we know that he built these cities? Now, the assumption is that El Pa'al lived after Yehoshua, and he built these cities. Dichtiv, B'nei El Pa'al, Ever u'Mish'am v'Shemer. His sons were so-and-so. That's this whole list in Chronicles of all the chronology of people. Hu banait Ono ve'et Lod ve'ubnotea. He built Ono, he built Lod, and the surrounding areas. So what do you see here? This isn't actually a question on the city Gei Harashim, but it's a question on Lod and Ono. It says El Pa'al built those cities, which means they couldn't possibly have been walled cities in the time of Yehoshua if someone later built the cities. So how can you say that, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi? So the Gemara answers back with like a counter question and says, which is really a further question on Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, but a bit of a question also on the person who claims El Pa'al built them. V'litamech Asa banani, but Asa was the one who built them, not El Pa'al. How do we know? Dichtiv, it also says in Chronicles, Vayiven Asa et arei habetzurot asher liYehuda. He built the fortified cities of Yehuda, which means that he must have built these cities because he must have fortified them anyway. So therefore, Asa is a much later king. So now it's really confusing. Who built them? Was it Yehoshua? Was it Asa? Was it El Pa'al? How do we explain this? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Hani mukafot choma miyemot Yehoshua ben Nun havu. Okay, now we're going to get a chronology of what happened. This is very similar to what we have with the Mansapach and the other issues where we said, oh, well, they forgot them, right? With the Targum also, right? Where it was a certain way, then they forgot it, and Chazul v'Yisdum, and then they established it again. So here he says, they were walled cities from the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Charuv, they were destroyed. Now, when were they destroyed? What would be the most obvious? Because this was in the Shetach, it was in the area of Binyamin. So they were Charuv b'yemei Pilegesh, they were like by Binyamin and Yehuda. So Charuv b'yemei Pilegesh b'Giva, when they had the whole civil war with the Binyaminites. So then it got destroyed in that battle. V'ata El Pa'al banani, El Pa'al came back and rebuilt them. Hadar Inpul. Now, here we don't have an answer as to when this happened, but the walls must have fallen an additional time. Ata Asa Shaptzinu, and Asa fixed them. So there you have it, that all 3 of them built the same cities because something happened to the city in the interim. Okay, again, Zaikanami, we're going to further prove this. Dichti vayom Yehuda nivne et ha'arim ha'el. They say in the psukim about Asa, it says, he said to Yehuda, let's build these cities. Okay, and then they say, Michlal da'arim havu me'ikara. So if you want to build these cities, if you want to take an area that isn't a city and you want to build a wall around it and turn it into a city, it's not called a city until you actually do it. So the fact that it says he built up these cities, it means they were cities already to begin with, and then he just rebuilt the wall that had been broken. Okay, Shema Mina. So from here you see, by the way, again, we're getting back to the same idea of reinstating something that was not instated properly or got lost along the way. And we talked about it yesterday, that the Kimu v'Kiblu HaYehudim was a re-accepting of the Torah. And I think, again, these ideas seem to be coming up over and over again, the beginning of this Masechet, to kind of highlight how the rabbis viewed this holiday of Purim, that it wasn't just, okay, we were saved from a miracle, but there was this reconnection of the Jewish people to God. Okay, some sort of re-acceptance of the Torah, as the Midrashim say, about Kimu v'Kiblu, right? Again, as we said yesterday, Kafar lehemar kigigit, right? That in the beginning, when they got the Torah, it was forced upon them. And then at Purim, they accepted it on their own volition. Okay, so that's the first law of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi of today, which is really the fifth in the row of the ones we saw yesterday. Here comes a big one. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, even though the Gemara is not going to discuss this at all, it's the only one it doesn't discuss. Nashim chayavot b'mikra Megillah she'af ein hayu b'oto hanes. Women are also obligated in Kriyat Megillah because they too were part of the miracle. Now, there's a big machloket in Pesachim. We talked about it then. What does it mean, af ein hayu b'oto hanes? In the Yerushalmi, it says, af ein hayu b'oto safek. They were also going to be destroyed, and they were saved as part of the miracle. Some say, no. They were the main reason for the mitzvah was Esther. She was the heroine of the story. So because of that, women are obligated. So there's two different opinions as to why women are obligated. Is it because they were also going to be destroyed, or is it because they were the main players there? So now there's a very famous Tosfot here, and I'll read it quickly with you. Nashim chayavot b'mikra Megillah. Mikan mashma, from here it seems to be inferred. Shanashim motziot et acherim yidei chovatan. Sounds like women, if they have the same obligation as men, then they can be motzim, they can read the Megillah for men. So he says, based on this, it says women are obligated. It sounds like they're obligated just like the men. Because it doesn't say to hear the reading of the Megillah. Okay, there's two ways you can, and there's a big machloket, and I'm bringing you Tosfot here. There's a big machloket you should know about whether women are obligated, like men are obligated, to read the Megillah, or maybe they're only obligated to hear the Megillah. And if you've ever noticed this, there's different ways that women do. When women have Kriyot Megillah of women specifically, there's a debate about what blessing they should say. Should they say Al Mikra Megillah, like normally, or should they say Lishma Megillah? Because maybe their obligation is just to hear and not to read. So there's a big debate about this. And we'll see a little bit. I don't want to get into all the opinions because we're not doing a Shiur B'iyun. We could do that. But here Tosfot says, it sounds from here like their obligation is exactly the same. And then, he says in Erchin, it says, Hakol Kshirim L'Krot Megillah. Everyone is kshirim to read the Megillah. And they say there, Hakol Kshirim La'Tuye Mai. Why does it say everyone? What does everyone include? And they say, La'Tuye Nashim. So it sounds like even Lahotzi Anashim. But then he raises a question from another sugya. He says, V'kashet, because in the Tosefta, okay, the Tosefta says explicitly, Tumtum is not motzi, lo et mino v'lo she'enu mino. Ones who are safek male, safek female. Remember, we had all these cases of tumtum and droginus. These are people who either we don't know which one they are, or they have simanim of both. And then, so they can't fulfill the obligation for others. That sounds like they don't have the same obligation. So, because if they had the same obligation, what's the matter if you're a male or female? You should be able to anyway, if everyone's got the same obligation. So I'm going to skip a little bit. And then he says, right? And Isha is no better than that. And if androgynous and a tumtum can't be motzi, someone who's not like them, then how can a woman? And the Bahag is the famous Shita where he says that the Baal Halachot Gedolot from the time of the Gaonim, he says women cannot be motzi other men. So here's like a big debate. Okay. And then Yesh Lomar Nashim. You might have thought maybe then if they're only obligated to hear, then how could they read for somebody else, right? If you're only obligated to hear, you might not be able to even read. But there he says for sure that, right? Kamash malan de chayavim. So the Bahag reinterprets the hakol chayavim. Hakol chayavim is they're chayavim in the sense that they can fulfill the obligation for others, but only others at their level. So there's a big debate about this. And it's based on some other sources as well. I'm not getting into all of it. Just so you know, there's a big debate. Can women also fulfill the obligation for men or only for other women who are obligated in the same way as they are? Right? In other words, if they can fulfill the obligation for men, it's because their obligation is exactly the same. So what it really is rooted in, is their obligation the same as men or not the same as men? And that's a really big question. And that's why there's all different opinions. This is just a good way of seeing why, right? Some people have co-ed readings. Some people have, where even women read. Some people have only women reading for women. And it's based on these different opinions and, different approaches to how to rule on this situation. But everyone agrees that women can read for women. Now, people who don't allow women reading for women, that's a whole other issue, which is definitely not a halachic issue, more of a societal, sociological issue about whether they feel that it's okay to have women kriyot and things like that. That's a whole different issue, but it's not halachic because it's clear, right? And Tosfos says it very clearly, right? There's no one who thinks that they can't fulfill the obligation for others. Now, again, just because no one thinks it doesn't mean maybe someone does think it, but it's really generally accepted that women can fulfill the obligation for other women. Okay, getting back to our topic, but right, certain tangents you just can't not get off on them. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Purim shachal liyot b'Shabbat, sho'alim v'dorshim b'inyanos shel yom. And by the way, it's just interesting here that the Gemara doesn't. I just want to go back to the women. On everything he says, there's questions. On this one, the Gemara doesn't question this at all. It seems very clear cut to the Gemara. But then you see that some things are not as clear cut, even though it seems clear cut, right? How do we understand this line? So now the next halakha, okay, we're up to number 7. Purim shachal liyot b'Shabbat. If Purim falls on Shabbat, sho'alim, now you don't read the Megillah. We'll get to that at the end of the daf, why that is. But sho'alim v'dorshim b'inyanos shel yom. You learn that usually it means the halachot of that day, but you're going to see that what they mean is you learn the Megillah. You sit and you learn Megillah on Shabbos, okay? It's almost like an obligation here. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita. I skipped a line. My iria Purim, afilu Yom Tov nami, but wait. Why would Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi say this specifically about Purim? When Purim falls on Shabbat, learn things that relate to Purim. Gemara says, what do you mean? This is true for every holiday, not just Purim. Afilu Yom Tov nami, even any other holiday. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Moshe tikein lahem liyisrael. Moshe instituted for the Jewish people, Shiur sho'alim v'dorshim b'inyanos shel yom, that you should always learn the halachot of that particular day. Hilchot haPesach bePesach, Hilchot haTzeret beAtzeret, Hilchot Chag b'Chag. Pesach, you learn the halachot of Pesach. Shavuot, you learn the halachot of Shavuot. Sukkot, you learn the halachot of Sukkot. So why would it say it specifically about Purim? Before we get to the answer, I want to point out this big problem with this source that the commentaries grapple with, which is, I'm not going to give you answers, but this big question, which is, there's all these sources to talk about. You might remember we learned this in Psachim. Sho'alim v'dorshim kodem hachag. Before the holiday, you have to learn the halachot. And there's a machloket. Is it a whole month before? Is it 2 weeks before? So this says on the day of. What happened to 2 weeks before, a month before? Right? Some commentaries say these are two different obligations. One is to prepare for the holiday and do that, and one is on the holiday itself, and that they're two different things entirely. So in any case, for our purposes, why did Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi say it just about Purim? It's true for every holiday. So Purim itzrichale. He had to specify Purim. Again, the Gemara assumes you already know what it's going to say later on, which is there's this famous Gzera de Rabba, which we learned by Lulav, we learned by Shofar, and by Megillah, which is we're worried that you're going to carry the Megillah four cubits in Rishut Rabim, and that which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, and therefore we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat. So you might have thought maybe you can't learn Megillah on Shabbat either, because maybe you'll carry it. Yeah, he comes to teach you, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. We're not worried that if we say that you're supposed to learn the Megillah, then you're going to carry the Megillah. And that's why he points it out specifically in Purim. Last halach of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Chayav adam likrot et Megillah balayla ulishnota b'yom. Here we have it. This is where we get it from, that you have to read the Megillah twice. Okay, you might say, why are we reading the Megillah twice? So we're going to see. Shene'emar. You might not be convinced by this answer, but Elohai ekra yomam v'lo ta'aneh v'layla v'lo dumiyali. This is a parak in Tehillim, which starts off with Lamentzech al Ayelet HaShachar. The Gemara in Yoma connected Ayelet HaShachar to Esther, if you remember this. And therefore, this has to do with Esther, and therefore it has to do with the Megillah. And it says, I will call to you in the morning and won't get during the day and won't get answered. And Laila v'lo dumiyali, and at night and I won't be silent for me. So now here you have that someone turns to God twice, both during the day and at night. Okay, and that's how we get that you're supposed to read it twice. Now, Tosfot here, if you look at the end Tosfot on the daf, there's just too many interesting things not to talk about them. In other words, here we're getting to very practical. It's just nice when we learn Gemara to understand where we get all these things that we do. And if you've paid attention, you know that we read the Megillah at night and we say the bracha of Shechian. Then we read the Megillah again in the morning and we do something strange. we say the bracha of Shechianu, even though we already said it the night before. So why do we say it twice? So it comes to us when he says it's learned out from our sugya. Even though you said Shechianu already at night. Why? He says the main Persume Nisa is in the day. Where does he get this from? So he says, Ukra. So notice it said, you're supposed to read the Megillah at night and repeat it during the day. That doesn't really sound like the Ikar Kriya is during the day. But the Pasuk said, Ukra nami mashmaken dichtiv v'layla v'lo dumiyali. The Pasuk said, I will do it during the day and also at night. Okay? But that means that the night is additional and the day is the main one. And that's why he claims to say Shechianu. Another reason, by the way, is that you're supposed to be thinking of the mitzvot of the day. It's also for that, also for Mishloach Manot and Matanot Lev Yonim. And, because of that, it also applies to those mitzvot and the Suda. So because of that. Now, then he says, right, Klomar, the way it is even though you read it during the day, you also have to read it at night. And the Ikar is in the day. And why? Okay, that's the same thing. Then he points out, also, it connects with the fact that the Seuda has to be done in the day. And he quotes some sugya that say, if you eat your meal at night, you don't fulfill your obligation. You have to eat another meal during the day. So from there, he also says, it says, Nizkarim v'na'asim, we saw that in the Gemara before. The Zechira, which is Megillah, is like the Asiyah, and the Asiyah mitzvot is during the day. Therefore, the Ikar Megillah is during the day. So you have to say it at night because it's the first time you're doing it, but you have to say it during the day because that's the main mitzvah. Okay, that's what Tosfot claims. So now, going back to our Gemara says, Savor Minah, when they heard this, that you have to read the Megillah twice, Lemikre Balelia, that you have to read the Megillah at night. And during the day, you learn Perushim on it. You learn the Mishnayot, the stuff that are, like the Gemara type things about it. Not that you have to actually read the Megillah twice. That's what they thought. Amarlu Rabbi Yirmiyah, but Rabbi Yirmiyah said, no, Ledidi Mefresh Lemined Rabbi Chia bar Abba. I was told that the way Rabbi Chia bar Abba explained it was, Kigon de Amre Inashe, like people say, Vor Parshata da ve'etnie. I will read over the Parsha and then I will read it again. And that's the idea. And if you think about what's the idea of reading the Megillah twice, right? It could be, it's like Shnayim Mikra ve'echad Targum. You're supposed to read the Parsha twice and then once with the Targum that we were discussing the other day. But that you read it twice. In other words, usually you read something the first time, you don't read it well enough. So we read it again, kind of get it into your head and stress the importance of it. So that's what he says. Itmar Nami, it was also said, so meaning you don't learn it, you read it twice. Itmar Nami, it was also said, Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Ula Bira'ah, Chelbo said in the name of Rabbi Ula Bira'ah, Chayav Adam lekot et Megillah balayla, Ula shnot b'yom, and he quotes a different verse, which is funny because it's the verse that is associated with, it's in Mizmor Shir Chanukat HaBayit LeDavid, which is associated with the holiday of Hanukkah. It's opposed to Ayelet HaShachar, which is associated with Esther. But there it says, L'man yizamercha kavod v'lo yidom Hashem Elokai le'olam odecha. L'man yizamercha kavod, so that I sing your praises, and v'lo yidom, and I won't be silent. Okay, I think there's some issue here about the silence, right? Almost like I say something and then I'm not silent, I have to say more. Okay, it's not enough to just say and then move on. There is also this issue that when you do something once and then you just move on, but if you do it twice, then it's more ingrained and you're more connected with it. You're not just doing it and moving on. Okay, next. Now we get back to the beginning of the Masechet and 2 recommended things to read or listen to on our site. Shuli Mishkin wrote about, she has a section called Flashback about historical perspective on things. So she talks about the walled cities and all the differences of the type of cities, etc. And this whole issue of reading the Megillah on different days. And Rabbanit, Shiur, and Chamutal in Hebrew and Daf Mishanahan also discuss this issue. And they talk about, people in the periphery and people in the main cities and kind of take some ideas out of this sugya. So now, חכמים הקילו על הקברים ליום מקדימים ליום הכניסה, כדי שיספקו מים ומזון לאחיהם שבכרכים. This we already saw quoted on Daf Bet, which is, the Rabbi Hanina says, what's the reason for that the people in the villages read on an earlier day on Monday or Thursday before, when it comes out not on a Monday and Thursday? The rabbis were lenient with those people so that, here's the key words, so that they can bring water and food to their friends in the big cities. Now, we talked about it before that possibly it makes sense because they live near water and the big cities aren't necessarily near water, and they have fields and the big cities don't have fields. So they're the ones bringing the food, even though generally, right, especially if you compare it to people in the periphery, they usually have less. Here, they're almost saying that they have more things and they need to do that. Big lack of clarity here, okay? And even once we finish the sugya, it's going to be not so clear, right? Normally, when we discuss, and I mentioned this when we learned it in the first daf, when we discuss this issue of the people in the cities, the villages, we usually say they don't know how to read. We allow them, they're going anyway for the shuk on that day, or they're going to the courts, or they're going maybe to hear Torah reading. So there's different Rishonim commentaries who have different reasons as to why they're going to the big city. That's less important to us right now. But the main thing is we're letting them go to the city on that day to make their lives easier, kind of, right? They're going anyway, let them go. But this seems to imply that they need to bring food to their brothers in the cities. And Rashi says there in the Mishnah on Daf Bet that we read, he says on Purim, they have to do that. So we want to let them read it earlier so that on Purim, and that's the way the Gemara seems to understand this right now, so that on Purim, they're free to go to the big cities to bring them food. It's a little bit strange if they're already going to the big cities. So why don't they just read the Megillah there? So now we're gonna read on and see what the Gemara has to say with this. So lememra ditakanta dikrachim have. This sounds like we want to free them up on Purim so that they can bring food to their brothers. And by the way, the main point is, and that they'll still have time to do their Suda and do the other things that they need to do. And it sounds like it's all because of them bringing food to these other people and they need to have the time. So now they say v'hatnan, but doesn't it say in a Mishnah? We're going to bring a slew of questions. Chali up a sheni. If it's on Monday, what happens? Do you remember? If your Dalit falls on Monday. So they both read on Monday, both the big cities and, right, other than the walled cities, but we're not talking about them right now, and the villages. So kfarim va'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. Both of them read on the 14th. V'im ita, if we're worried that they're going to be busy bringing food to their brothers on Monday because that's the day of Purim and they need to bring the food, then we should say on that year, what will you do? Bring it on the Thursday before. Read the Megillah on the Thursday before, right? Read Megillah on Thursday so that on Monday, when it's the holiday and you're supposed to be bringing food, you have enough time to bring the food to your brothers and right in the big cities and also get back in time to eat your Purim Suda. So we should really make it earlier. So what does the Gemara answer? Well, it's a big problem. If it's Monday and you want to go back to Thursday and do it on Thursday, what's the problem? What day of the week, what date of the month is that? It's Yud. Have Eluhu Asarat, the 10th day. Vasaralo Tkinu Rabbanam. Remember our Mishnah? You could do it on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, blah, 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 but no earlier and no later. You can't read it on the 10th, so it's just not possible. So theoretically, you should, based on this reason, but you can't, so there's no choice. We're going to get back to this idea later in today's stuff about, well, if you have no choice, you have no choice. There's a value, right? There's a certain reason. Sometimes you just can't do it because there's other conflicting things. Tashma, of course, you could say the rabbi should have instituted then Yud as an option. Where they got it from, there's some reference in the Megillah for 5, but still they could have somehow gotten around that. Tashma, don't worry about this because eventually we're going to reinterpret the whole thing. So even though we have partial answers to these questions, in the end, we're going to have a question without an answer. We're going to have to change a little bit about what Rabbi Hanina actually said. Tashma. So let's look at this source. Chali, which is also going to be a difficulty against Rabbi Hanina. Chali op ha'chamishi. If it's on Thursday, there's going to be the same type of question. Vim ita likadmu liyom ha'knisa. Da'achadasarhu. In this case, you could move it to Monday. Because if it's Thursday and you move it to Monday, right? Your Dalit is Thursday. That means Monday is Yud Aleph. So you should be able to move it to Monday because it's within the range. And yet we don't. So now the Gemara says, okay, fine. So that wasn't a good enough answer that it was the 10th. And that's why, the real reason is miyom ha'knisa liyom ha'knisa lo dachina. You can't push it earlier to a different Yom HaKnisa. In other words, there's certain parameters. The parameters are you can move it to the previous Yom HaKnisa as long as, right, you're not in a Yom HaKnisa itself. They don't really give an answer as to why you can't, but they say you can't. And that's why it doesn't work. Again, they're going to say it was just impossible. But theoretically, in terms of the concept, it should have been able to, you should have done this, but practically it can't work because it doesn't fit in with within the parameters. Again, it's not the greatest answer, but don't worry because in the end, the question is really going to be a good question and we're going to answer it some other way. Tashma. Now we bring a source that we already learned. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Matai. When is this true? That we do it earlier. In a place where generally they gathered on Mondays and Thursdays. If it's a place where they don't normally gather on Mondays and Thursdays in the city, then you don't read it only in its proper day. Now, if the whole thing is that we're doing it so that they can bring food on Yudalid to their brothers, and we want them to do it in an earlier date, so what's the difference? So because people don't gather on Mondays and Thursdays, now we're going to penalize the people in the cities, because people in the cities now won't get their food because the people in the villages are busy on Yudalid reading the Megillah. Just so one has nothing to do with the other. The fact that they would gather or wouldn't gather on Mondays or Thursdays is irrelevant. In which case they say, okay, so this can't possibly be it. Lo tema. So don't say kideshi yisapku mayim mazon, that the whole point is so that they can bring food to their brothers in the cities. No, it's not that. Ela ema, you should say it like this. Mipnei shemisapkim mayim mazon lacheihem shebekrachim. Because, now remember the beginning of the sentence, the rabbis, hikilu, they were lenient with them. They gave a very big leniency to these people as a reward for them, meaning, right, because you do, it's like in your house, right? If your kids do something really nice, so you say, listen, because of that, I'm going to give you something else, right? I'll be nice to you in some other area, right? Or even just not as a reward, but if you see someone's going out of their way to do one thing, so you might be lenient for them in something else because they've already gone out of their way in one way, and therefore you'll definitely be more lenient in some other way. So here they're saying, what's the issue? Because they serve their brothers in the cities and they schlep and they bring them food and water, therefore they're going to say, listen, we know it's not so easy for you. Now let's go back to the Mondays and Thursdays only in a place where they go Mondays and Thursdays. When they go Mondays and Thursdays to the big city, in a time when that's what people did, then or in a city where that's where people go on Mondays and Thursdays, if the villagers come into the big city, we're going to say, listen, we know you make a big effort to help your brothers in the city. So once you're already there, we'll let you read Megillah while you're there so that you don't have to go back another time. And that's the concept here, that we're basically saying we're going to be lenient with you because you help us help other people out. We're going to be lenient with you and allow you that once you're already there, we'll allow you to help, right, to basically get your Megillah reading in at the same time. Okay, and then it becomes a little difficult with what Rashi said earlier, and maybe Rashi was only on what we thought originally, because then it doesn't sound like they're coming to the big city to bring them food on Purim, because if they were, they could just read the Megillah then. Again, there's a bunch of things that are not so clear in the sugya and are interpreted in all different ways by different commentaries. I'm going to just put it out there. Sometimes we learn things and it's just not so clear what exactly is happening here. But the assumption is, the way I understand it is, they bring food to them. And therefore the rabbis say, since you do something that's important, we're going to let you, when you're already there anyway, like let's say you're bringing the food, we'll let you do your mitzvah then so that you don't have to go back another time. Okay, they're making their lives a little bit easier. Okay, in order to allow them to continue to do this on a regular basis, right? If they make their lives more difficult, have to come more, then they might delay the food delivery. Okay, again, it's unclear exactly how this delivery service worked and what exactly the reality of this is a little bit complicated. And I don't know if in every village this is what they did, that they always brought the water and the food to the city. It's hard to really understand. And what I find the most interesting about this is, I imagine that most of you never really heard this line before you learned it in the daf here. And it's very interesting because when we learn the sugya in school, they don't really usually teach us about this. They usually say, it's because they didn't know how to read and they had to go to the city, and they just, while they were in the city anyway, they did this. And they don't really quote this part about because they brought food and water. I don't really know why that is. So I'm going to leave you with a question that I don't have a good answer to, which is, why did this whole thing of Rabbi Hanina really never get discussed so much on maybe because it's hard to understand. It's possible. Okay, moving on. Ketzad. So now we're going to get into the Mishnah itself. So the first question we're going to have is a question which is more of why was the Mishnah written in this format? Okay, the format of the Mishnah is a little bit strange. It starts off, Megillah Mikret Bit, Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Aleph, Tef Vav. It's talking about days of the month. So the Gemara starts off and says, Maishna Resha Dinakat Sidur Diyarcha. Why in the beginning of the Mishnah did it start listing days of the month? Why is that different? Maishna means what's the difference? That in the beginning of the Mishnah it started using days of the month, and then Maishna Seifa Dinakat Sidur Diyoma. Then it started saying, well, if you're Dalit, it didn't even say you're Dalit. If the day falls out, Bo Bayom, right? I'm sorry, Bayom Sheni, right? Chal Lihiyot. They don't even right. It does say in the first one, Chal Lihiyot you're Dalit B'Sheni. If it comes up on a Monday, starts to talk in the language of days of the week, as opposed to days of the month. So it started off with days of the month, and then notice it never goes back. And that's why I actually made a calendar on the sheet of the first day, so that you could have it look, organized by calendar, by dates, because it doesn't tell you in which case is it on the 11th, in which case is it on the 12th, in which case is on the 13th, which is what you would have expected. So why in the Sefer does it talk about Sidur de Yomi and not the Sidur de Yarcha, the days of the week and not the days of the month? So they give a very interesting answer. They thought it would be very confusing. They thought that if they start telling you, then do it on your Dalit, your Aleph, do it on your bed, do it on your Gimel. You'd have to think in your head, what day of the week is that? And it would be very confusing. So they thought it was just an easier way for people to follow the Mishnah if they just use days of the week. So they started off by telling you the days of the month because that's important. It goes from Yud Aleph to Tevav. But after that, they moved to days of the week so that they don't cause confusion. Okay, even though the Mishnah is a little confusing as it is, but they say so as not to cause confusion, right? I guess maybe it would be even more confusing if they hadn't done that. Also, by the way, right, everyone can understand, right, things that are confusing to one person are not necessarily confusing to another person. So that's also could be that maybe it would have been more clear to some of you if they had done dates, but to other people it might have been more confusing. So that's also, I think about, right, like my mess on my desk. I know what my mess on my desk is and where everything is, but it doesn't look like a mess to me, but it might be a mess to somebody else. Okay, Erev Shabbat. So now what happens if it's Erev Shabbat? Let's go back to the Mishnah. Purim falls out on Erev Shabbat, Yud Dalet. So what do we do? The Mishnah says, Kfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. The villages go back a day. Va'ayarot gdolot umukafot choma korim bo bayom. The big cities and the walled cities all read on Friday. Okay, why do they read on Friday? Yud Dalet because it's Yud Dalet, because that's the day. And Tevav because they can't read on Shabbat. So they read the day before because they can't read the day after, because remember, you can't go past the 15th of the month. So now, Manitimane, the Gemara says, who does this Mishnah go like? Okay, we're going to see that not everybody agrees with this opinion. Again, you get a Mishnah and you think this is all there is. Now we're going to learn that there's some other opinions about this. In fact, there's 3 different opinions by 4 different people. Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi say the same thing. Manitimane, Rabbi Yossi. It could be both Rebbe or Rabbi Yossi. And now we're going to see my Rebbe, and then we're going to see my Rabbi Yossi. And each one, and I charted this out on the sheet, the chart will help you. Each one says, argues with a different Tana, okay? The Tana, we call them Tanakama. That means the first Tana. It means the persons that's not mentioned by name. So each one is in a Braita with a Tana first that says something else. And the 2 Tanakamas, I don't like, if you say Tanakama, it sounds like they're the same person. The Tanakama of Rebbe says something different than the Tanakama of Rabbi Yossi. So, but Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi say the same thing. My Rebbe, Ditanya. Erev Shabbat. Okay, this is first Tanakama, not Rebbe. If it's Erev Shabbat, Kfarim va'ayarot gdolot makdimim liyom haknisa. According to Tanakama, the big city people, when Friday is the 14th, they read on the 13th, on Thursday, with the villagers. Umukafim choma, walled cities, korim bo bayom, they read on the 14th, because again, they can't read on the 15th, it's Shabbat. Rebbe Omer, he says, Omer ani, I say, lo yidachu ayarot mimkoman. Don't. If it falls on the 14th, and that's the day the big city people are supposed to read the Megillah, don't move them to Thursday. Have them read on their day. Ela elu ve'elu korim bo bayom. So therefore, he must conclude, right? Well, he does conclude. This is what he says. Since the people in the big cities read on the 14th, because that's the day of the 14th, and that's the day they're supposed to read, and the mukafin choma have no choice. The walled cities, they have to read earlier, so they also read on the 14th. And that's just the way it is. So now we're going to see my taima. Okay, so what's the reason for both opinions? So my taima to Tanakama. Now, everyone is going to darshan it. It's a little bit confusing, but it's actually kind of simple, which is they all learn it from the words, all 4 opinions we're going to see. B'chol shana b'shana, every year, which means every year it's the same thing. Now, it's not the same thing every year. So what does it mean every year it's the same thing? It's the same thing from a particular perspective, and each one's going to focus on it's the same in a particular way. One aspect is going to have to remain the same, and then others might have to change. So it's all a matter of where you put your priorities, right? There's a list of things that, let's say, you would normally do that are the same from year to year, but sometimes that can't happen. So something has to give. So the question is, what has to stay constant and what is going to give? So each one has a different, right? The way I'd say it is each one has a different red line as to what line they're not willing to cross. So here goes. B'chol shana v'shana, every year it's the same. Ma kol shana v'shana ayarot kodmot lemukafin. One thing that has to stay constant, according to Tanakama, is that the people who are supposed to read on the 14th and the people who are supposed to read on the 15th, right? The walled cities and the not walled cities have to read on different days. It doesn't matter 14, 15 necessarily. It could be 13, 14, which is what Tanakama says. But they have to read on different days. It's almost like we talked about in the beginning. What, we're making agudot, we're having different people do different things. It seems crazy. Not only do we need to do that, but we need to do it that when the 14th falls on Friday, even the people in the big cities don't read on the day they're supposed to read, so that we keep this concept that there's a split between the people in the walled cities and the people not in the walled cities. That's such an important concept, according to Tanakama. So now, just like B'chol Shana, the Ayarot read on a different day, the city people read on a different day of the walled cities, Afkan, likewise here, Ayarot Komot Kafin. So this year we have to keep that constant. So now they question him, and they're going to question him basically with what Rebbe is going to say. Why don't you say ve'ema b'chol shana v'shana ma kol shana v'shana ein nitchina yarot mimkoman? Every year, the people who read on the 14th, the big city people, never change their date, right? There's only one time they change their date, that's on Shabbos. But if it's not on Shabbos, they never change their date. They always read on the 14th. It's only the villagers that read earlier. So afkan lo yidachu yarot mimkoman. What's the most important? That the people who are supposed to read on the 14th read on the 14th. Okay, that we don't change that date. That's what's more important. So then they say, right? So Ve'ema, why don't you say like Tanakama? Ve'ema, right, sorry. I'm sorry, we're on Tanakama. Why doesn't Tanakama say, just like every year, Eini Dachim Ayarot Mimkoman, also here, the Ayarot shouldn't be pushed off from their places. So now they say, Shane Hacha de lo efshar. We have no choice. Normally, people on the 14th read on the 14th, but in this case, we're stuck. Why are we stuck? It all depends where you draw your red line. We're stuck because we have to have a separation between the city people and the walled city people. So therefore, we're stuck. So we move them a day earlier and we move them a day earlier. Okay, that's Tanakama. Rebbe, we already know what he's going to say. This is going to be the exact mirror of the previous thing, which is Rebbe's going to say, Rebbe, my time, b'chol shana v'shana. Ma kol shana v'shana ein ayarot nitchim mimkomam. They always read on the 14th, unless we have absolutely no choice. Afkan lo yidachu ayarot mimkomam. So they stay on the 14th. So they question him, why don't you hold like Tanakama though? Why don't you say ve'ema? Why don't you say b'chol shana v'shana ma kol shana v'shana ayarot kodmot lemukafin? Every year, the walled cities read not on the same day as the not walled cities. Afkanami. And according to you, they're all reading on the same day, on the 14th. So here also you should say ayarot kodmot lemukafin. To which he says, Shanei hacha de lo efshar. In other words, again, if you say my red line is that if the 14th can be, if you can read the Megillah on the 14th, then the big cities have to read on the 14th. Then the walled cities have no choice because they have to be moved earlier. They're going to end up being on the same day as the cities. We have no choice. We have no choice. Okay. So again, depending on what your red line is, then it depends on what you have no choice about. What you say, well, I have to give in there because I have no choice. Each one says the opposite of the other. Now we're going to see my Rabbi Yossi. So that was Rebbe and Tanakama, and now we're going to have Rabbi Yossi. Ditanya. The mukafin and the kfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. This is a very interesting approach. What does he say? He says, when it's on Friday, what happens? Here, I'll just read one more line. Vayarot gdolot korim bo bayom. He says, partly like the Mishnah, that what? Not like the Mishnah. This is Tanakama of Rabbi Yossi. He says, like the Mishnah in the sense that the people in the big cities stay on the 14th, like Rebbe said. You can read on the 14th, you read on the 14th. But what does he say? Very strange. The walled cities go back 2 days to the 13th. Okay, what's the main reason? So that they're not on the same day as the big cities. We want to differentiate between the big cities and the walled cities. So therefore, the mukafin go back, jump earlier to the 13th, which is strange because then order's off. So that's what he says. Rabbi Yossi Omer, what are you talking about? You can't have the walled cities reading before the big cities. The whole thing was that they were still fighting later. You can't possibly switch that order. So he says, like Rabbi and like the Tan of our Mishnah, the walled cities in this case read on the same day as the big cities. So again, my Tanakama, what's the reason for Tanakama? Again, they're going to all say it has to be the same year after year. Number one, every year, the Ayarot always read on the 14th. So that's going to stay. But we also have this other thing, which is Manoshal Zeh, Los Manoshal Zeh. But the Mukafin and the Ayarot can't read on the same day as the walled cities and the not walled cities. Therefore, Afkan Ayarot Arba Asal was Manoshal Zeh, Los Manoshal Zeh. And therefore, we're going to move the Mukafin to the 13th. Ve'ema, why don't you say, and this is going to be when they ask Tanakama, why don't you say like what Rabbi Yossi is going to say? Which is ve'ema b'chol shana v'shana mal kol shana v'shana emu kafin kodmin la'ayarot avkan emu kafin kodmin la'ayarot. Why don't you say it's like every other year where you never do the walled cities before the walled city, unwalled cities. So shani hachadilo efshar, again he's going to say like everybody, right? You have no choice. And if your red line is this, then you have no choice but to say that. You have no choice about the other issue. Yes, it's an issue, but this time we have to override that issue. My time to Rabbi Yossi, what's his reason? This is going to be the exact flip of Tanakama. That's my red line. My red line is walled cities can never go before unwalled cities. Afkan, so therefore here, so to which they say to him, Afkan, why don't you say like Tanakama though? That the walled cities and the non-walled cities have to read on different days because I'm going to lose that whole concept this year. In this case, there's no choice, he says, because if you can't move the Mukafin earlier, and the 14th, people who normally read on the 14th read on the 14th, the big cities, so you have no choice but to put them on the same day as the walled cities. So we have three different opinions. Again, just to review, do we move the walled cities to the 13th? That was the Tanakama of Rabbi Yossi that we just said. They move earlier so as to keep your Dalet and Tefaf separate. Or do they read on the same day? Or do we move the big cities to the day before, even though really they should read on the 14th, but in order to create this 13-14 differentiation, like the 14-15 differentiation, maybe we do it like that. So those are the different opinions. So therefore, our Mishnah is like both Rabbi Yossi and Rebbe. Now we're going to question Rebbe. V'sava Rebbe ayarot lo dachina liyom haknisa. Rebbe really thinks that you don't move them earlier to the Thursday, the big cities. V'hatanya, it says in a Braita. Chaliyot b'Shabbat. When it falls on Shabbat, what do? Kfarim, this isn't Rebbe yet, by the way. This is Tanakama. Kfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. So the villagers, when it falls on Shabbat, what do? The people in the village read on Thursday. Ayarot gedolot korim be'erev Shabbat. Instead of reading on the 14th, they read on the 13th because it comes out on Shabbat. Umukafo chamal machal. And the walled cities read on the 15th, which comes out on Sunday. Rebbe Omer, but here comes Rebbe. What does he say? Omer ani, I hold. Once they're not reading on their day, because Shabbat is the 14th and they can't read on Shabbat, we're not going to push them to Friday. We're going to push them to Thursday. What's the value of pushing them to Thursday? Everybody gets to read together. It's always a value. It's more Pursuminisa. So we're going to move them to the 13th. So what do you see here? They do get moved sometimes to the Yom HaKnisa. So they say you're comparing apples and oranges. Hachi hashta. Once you're pushing it off to a different date, so it doesn't matter if it's going to be the 13th or the whatever date it's going to be. It doesn't really matter. Actually, I made a mistake. It's going to be on the 12th in this case, not on the 13th, right? Once they're moving it to a day that's not the 14th, what's the difference, 12 or 13? But here's Manam is Erev Shabbat, and therefore we're going to keep it on Friday. Kiman az lahada amar Rabbi Chelbo amar Rav Huna Purim shechali op Shabbat hakol nidchim liyom haknisa. Rav Huna said, the Purim shechali op Shabbat, everyone, when it's on Shabbat, everything gets pushed off to Thursday. According to who does that go? So first the Gemara says, which is obviously going to be Rebbe, that's what we just said. But first they say, everything is overridden. Everyone, but the walled cities aren't pushed off to the Yom HaKnisa. What do you mean, everyone? So the answer, no. Anyone who gets pushed off is pushed off. Obviously, the ones who are on the 15th read on the 15th on Sunday. So Kiman, here Rebbe. This goes like Rebbe. Okay, last part for today. Everybody agrees that Megillah doesn't get read on Shabbat. So why is that? My time. Everyone is obligated to read, but not everybody knows how to read. Therefore, we're worried that you might carry the Megillah to go to learn how to read the Megillah by somebody else, and you might forget and carry it in the public domain. And Hainu Tamid Deshofar, V'yavirenu Arba Amot, right? You'll carry it 4 cubits, which is forbidden in the public domain. Hainu Tamid Deshofar, V'hainu Tamid Lulav. Same reason for shofar, same reason for lulav. That's why we don't do any of these things on Shabbat, even though theoretically we should have been able to. That's the main reason given. But Rabbi Yosef adds another reason. Rabbi Yosef Amar, Mipnei she'eneihem shel aniyim nesuot b'mikam Megillah. The poor people come, and we're going to see this later, that those two go hand in hand. The poor people come when everybody congregates, right? What's the best place for a poor person to find money? When everyone's congregating. So since that's the case, the poor people come when they read the Megillah. If it's Shabbat, no one can give them money, so it's a problem. So therefore, and Tanya Namihachi, there's a brighter to support this. When the people in the village come early and read the Megillah earlier, also on that day, they give the money to they give their matanot levyonim, their tzedakah, and they distribute it on that day. So everything is done on that day, okay, with Mikra Megillah. So first the Gemara says, what do you mean? Afal pi shamru, adraba mishum de'amru. It's not even though, that's how the line started, even though they read it, they make it earlier, they do matanot levyonim. It should be because they said. So therefore, they say, yeah, really read it like this. Ela hoil va'amru shekvarim aktimim liyom hakseh, because they made them do the Megillah earlier. Govim ba b'yom and mechakim ba b'yom. They do all that tzedakah then. Mipnei she'eneihem shel aniyim nesuot b'mikra Megillah. Aval, we'll just finish one last line. Simcha ina noheget ela b'zmana. But happiness, meaning the Seudah and all that, happens on its actual day, which means on Shabbat. Now, I'm going to end with this issue, which is, what do you mean? Purim Mishulash, when Purim falls on Shabbat in Yerushalayim, which is the only place it happens nowadays, you actually do the Seudah on Sunday, not on Shabbat. So what is this Gemara talking about? So I just want to point out the Purim Mishulash is very clear. You do Matanot Levyonim, the poor people, and the Megillah, they go together hand in hand on Friday. You do Al Anisim and the Tfilot and the Kriyat Torah on Shabbat, and you do the Mishloach Manot and the Seudah on Sunday. However, there's varying opinions about this, somewhat based on our sugya. Some people say you do the meal on Shabbat. Other people say, what do you mean? You're doing a meal on Shabbat anyway. It's not going to be clear. You're doing it for Purim. So they push it off. But there's a whole debate about it, and it's not so clear cut. And some people say you do the Seudah on both days, both on Shabbat and on Sunday, and Mishloach Manot as well. You might say Mishloach Manot, what do you mean? You're going to carry. It's very strange. But in fact, there's a wide range of opinions. It's another example of, you think, when you see something, and this is what we do, you think that's the only opinion. And when you read the Gemara, you learn that there's many different opinions about this, and it's not so clear cut at all. So if anyone wants, you can look into it further about this Purim Mishulash, but just know there's a wide variety of opinions about it. As I said, somewhat based in our Gemara. Have a great day, everyone.